Good morning and welcome to this plenary panel session that features presentations by Professors Merold Westphal and Cyril O'Regan. I'm Bob Krushwitz with the Institute for Faith and Learning in the Philosophy Department here at Baylor, and it's my privilege to introduce our speakers in just a moment. Before I introduce them, though, I'm going to recognize Mark Tejan from University of West Georgia, who has an announcement for us. Mark.
Good morning. I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the Soren Kierkegaard Society, USA. The Soren Kierkegaard Society, in case you're not familiar with it, exists to encourage study and discussion of the thought of Kierkegaard in all its dimensions and ramifications, including its sources, influences, and relevance to ongoing debates. I wanted just to tell you a little about it. I think by my count we have no less than 6 past presidents of the Soren Kierkegaard Society, including Dr. Westphal, including Dr. Perkins, who was recognized last night, who was the founder of the Kierkegaard Society. So we are in good company as far as the society goes. The society mainly functions in terms of holding meetings at the AAR and the APA every year. And if you are interested in joining the society, it costs $10 for students each year, $15 for independent scholars or retired scholars, or $20 for regular memberships. I have information, including a little brochure about the society or the annual newsletter of the society, available for you at the check-in desk. If you're interested in joining or want to talk more about it, I'd be happy to talk with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. This morning, after our speakers speak in turn, they're going to briefly respond to one another, and then we look forward to your questions and comments at the end of our time together. The first presentation this morning will be by Merold Westphal, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Fordham University. He did his undergraduate work at Wheaton College and graduate studies at Yale University. Professor Westphal has served as the president of the Hegel Society of America, president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society, as you just heard, is executive co-director for the Society of Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, and has been a member of the National Board of the American Philosophical Association. His book, History of Truth in Hegel's Phenomenology, won a Choice Outstanding Book Award. God, Guilt, and Death, an Existential Phenomenology of Religion, won an American Academy of Religion Award for excellence. He's published 3 studies of Kierkegaard, and 2 more are on the way. Kierkegaard's Concept of Faith will be published next year by Erdman's, and if you were here last night, you received a flyer, I think, that has that information at the bottom. And next year, Mercer University Press will be publishing a collection of his essays, 7 essays that were published in the International Kierkegaard Commentary series. This Mercer book is unnamed, but that might be a good thing. Last night we learned that my colleague Steve Evans names his books and can't remember what he named them. So Merold apparently is erring on the side of caution and leaving this one unnamed, so just look for a nameless book from Mercer University Press next year. This morning, though, his presentation does have a name, Kierkegaard in Praise of Heteronomy. Our second presentation will be by Cyril O'Regan, the Catherine F. Husking Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He holds degrees from University College Dublin and Yale University. Specializing in systematic and historical theology, Professor O'Regan has specific interest in the intersection of continental philosophy and theology, religion and literature, mystical theology, and postmodern thought, especially the rise of contemporary Gnosticism. He's published numerous articles on the nature of tradition, on negative theology, and on a range of figures such as Hegel, John Henry Newman, and Hans Urs von Balthasar. He's the author of several books, including The Heterodox Hegel, Gnostic Return in Modernity, and Gnostic Apocalypse, Jakob Boehm's Haunted Narrative. Professor O'Regan's presentation this morning will be titled Kierkegaard, the Rule of Chaos and the Perturbation of Love. Please join me in welcoming Merold Westphal and Cyril O'Regan.
Let me say first that I think Cyril's book, The Heterodox Hegel, is one of the finest books on Hegel I have ever read. So I commend it to you very highly. By the word Kierkegaard, I mean to designate those writings which are published with his name on the cover. Whether he publishes them pseudonymously or in his own name, and to whatever degree they represent his own views about things, they are in some other sense very obviously his ideas. He had to formulate them. He had to write them down. He had to have them published so that they would be available for us to think about. And he thought that they were important enough to think about. So that's what I shall mean when I refer to Kierkegaard. His ideas are the ones that he wrote and published and gave to us as a gift and a task. Now, one can read Kierkegaard in at least 4 different ways: as an existentialist, as a hermeneutical phenomenologist, as a deconstructionist, and as a practitioner of ideology critique. But in each of those cases, he's a Christian thinker. And so his existentialism is different from that of Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus. And his hermeneutical phenomenology is different from that of Gadamer and Ricoeur. And his deconstruction is different from that of Derrida and all of Derrida's cousins. And his ideology critique is different from that of Marx and Habermas. But in the midst of all those differences, there are also similarities and convergences that I think are important. I don't want to say anything about Kierkegaard as an existentialist other than 2 recent books which do not fly the existentialist flag strike me as among the most important recent contributions to reading Kierkegaard in that way. Both of their authors are with us. Simon Podmore's book, Kierkegaard and the Self Before God. I mean, that phrase, the self before God, defines, for me at least, Kierkegaard's existentialism. We're not alone in an absurd universe to create ourselves. We are alone before God, and then in relationship to others. And then Mark Tietjen's Kierkegaard, Communication and Virtue. I don't know whether they welcome my suggestion that these are existentialist readings, but I'm sure they welcome the plug for their books. Now, Kierkegaard is a hermeneutical phenomenologist, it seems to me, in the sense that when he asks the phenomenological question, how is the self given to itself, and how is God given to the self, he recognizes that the answers we give are interpretations that come from a location. We're always somewhere, and we're never nowhere. I like to think of him as having appropriated what I take to be the central insight of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit over against the transcendental philosophies of Plato and Descartes and Kant. Hegel discovered that we are the transcendental ego, and that we are always some particular human community and tradition and so forth, so that the transcendental ego is in inescapable ways an empirical ego that has a conditioned historical location. Kierkegaard is also a Gadamerian insofar as he recognizes that the a priori that is the condition for the possibility of our interpretations is prejudice, prejudgments, and that the prejudices without which we couldn't interpret are born to us and given to us by tradition and by the language in which tradition is carried. And in that respect, he's a Gadamerian. He's a Ricoeurian in the sense that he makes what Ricoeur calls the detour through cultural artifacts, many of which are text. That is to say, our interpretations of things are often interpretations of prior interpretations which have been written down as text. And so we're always at second or third or 42nd remove interpreting through the detour of other interpretations. Now, one of the important implications of hermeneutical phenomenology for my interest in heteronomy is that what hermeneutical phenomenology makes clear to us is that we are heteronymous. Willy-nilly, we cannot help but be subject to something other than ourselves. And whatever creativity, intellectually or existentially, we may exhibit is conditioned by and made possible by that which is other than ourselves, which has come before us, and by which we are shaped in ways of which we are never fully aware and in ways over which we never fully preside. There's a passivity at the ground of every activity of the human self. And I take it that that is a sense in which Kierkegaard speaks a word in praise of heteronomy de facto. It's an inescapable feature of who it is that we are. Now, it seems to me, and I've been harping on this for a long time, that Derridean deconstruction and Gadamerhian hermeneutical phenomenology in important senses say the same thing. They say it with a different vocabulary, they say it in a different tone of voice. For Gadamer, the glass is half full. For Derrida, the glass is half empty. But in that situation, there's a pretty fundamental agreement about how much water is in the glass. And it ain't full. There's an inescapable finitude to human understanding. The single passage in Derrida that comes to mind there most immediately is the one in which he argues that every human autonomy is made possible by a prior human heteronomy. It's only as we are conditioned by that over which we didn't preside and which we did not create and of which we are not the ground and source that we are able to be active, whether that's intellectually or ethically or in any other way. And the way in which Derrida makes this point is very similar to the way in which Gadamer makes the point. He says, whenever we come on the scene, we come too late. Language has already begun. Language has already begun. And he doesn't just mean, although this is important, that I learn to speak whatever my native language is when I accommodate myself to a language which was already there when I was born. But I think he's using language in a richer sense, where language is not merely a grammar and a set of grammatical vocabulary and so forth, but language is the bearer of particular traditions. Or language is what Wittgenstein calls a language game. It's a form of life. It's a particular ethos. It's what Hegel calls Sittlichkeit, ethical life, the values of a particular human community. So I find in Derridean deconstruction an echo, if you like, an agreement, an important agreement with hermeneutical phenomenology in making the same point about the heteronomy, which is an inescapable part of what it is to be human. A way of talking about human finitude, a way of talking about the passivity which is prior to every human activity. I've been told I'm all wet, but sometimes that's not true. And I need a little help. Now, it's a fairly short step from the Gadamerian, Derridean sense in which we are de facto heteronomous, and therefore are just kidding ourselves if we buy into the Enlightenment ideals of autonomy. Autonomy is relativized in those two contexts, and so one can talk about whatever autonomy we are able to achieve, practically or theoretically, it's conditioned by heteronomy, and we shouldn't try to kid ourselves to the contrary. Now, it's but a short step from those insights, from whatever tradition one draws them, and one can draw those insights from from other sources as well, to ideology critique. Marx uses the term ideology in a narrower and more precise sense than we normally do. In popular contemporary discourse, ideology means any more or less coherent view about society, especially if one has what one might call a fundamentalist attitude toward that set of ideas, which needn't be religious. I'm using the term fundamentalist here as a rather generic term. But for Marx, the term ideology is best expressed by a sentence that appeared, first of all, in the posthumously published German Ideology, and then again in the Communist Manifesto. The ruling ideas of every epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. Ideas are ideological, not in terms of their content, but in terms of their function. And when ideas function to mirror a particular established order, and there are plenty of Kierkegaard lovers here who will hear the phrase established order as a Kierkegaardian phrase, ideas that mirror and reflect any particular community and its values, and then in turn provide legitimation for those values and that community, then they are functioning ideologically. And Marxian theory and Habermasian theory and others in the Marxist tradition are often described as ideology critique, because their critique of knowledge is a critique of the way in which ideologies purport to be rational insights. And there's a certain element of collective self-deception. I mean, ideology is subject to the hermeneutics of suspicion, and that's why Paul Ricoeur includes Marx among the masters of suspicion. One is suspicious that the ideas presented as insights are in fact self-interested on the part of the communities which foster them and present them as truth with a capital T. And of course, to present our ideas as truth with a capital T is to say, without the irony of Job, we are the people and wisdom will die with us. Now, the short step from hermeneutical phenomenology and deconstruction to ideology critique is simply the recognition that the heteronomy which is inescapable, the way in which we are shaped by ideas that precede us, by being socialized into not a community, but the several communities to which each of us belong, and by which each of us is shaped. That heteronomy can take the form of ideological self-justification. I find myself shaped by the ideas of the religious community in which I was brought up, the national community in which I was brought up, perhaps the race or the class or the gender, which happens to be mine. And I associate myself and attach myself to these ideas because they provide the justification for my being part of the true people who are superior to the others, whoever the others may be. And of course, there are all sorts of ways in which we and the others can be distinguished from each other. And I think Kierkegaard is, if anything, more ecumenical in his ideology critique than Marx, because Marx wants to narrow this down to economic classes. And his focus on ideology is the ideology of the dominant economic class. Kierkegaard is working with a theological category, namely sin. He thinks that whenever any community absolutizes itself by ideological thinking, whether it's a political community or an economic community or a religious community, that is sinful and ought to be exposed in critique. Now that, it seems to me, is what's going on in Fear and Trembling. The teleological suspension of the ethical, the claim that the laws and customs of my community are to be relativized, not abolished, but relativized over against the absolute authority of the revealed Word of God, is a protest against the ethical in a very specific sense. And it's often misread because he identifies the ethical with the universal. And the first mistake one can make there is to think by the universal one means some formal principle of morality, something like a Platonic form, something like Kant's categorical imperative, something like the utilitarian principle, in all your actions maximize pleasure or happiness or goodness or whatever version of utilitarianism is at issue. Kierkegaard is very clear that that is not the sense of the universal that he has in mind in Fear and Trembling. He gives 5 examples of a universal, and they are the nation, the state, society, the church, and the sect. Each one of those is not a formal principle, but a concrete community of human beings. And they're universal because the relationship is between the whole and the part. I am a particular insofar as I belong to a church or a sect or a society or a state or a nation. And what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, the example that is used, the ethical that has to be relativized, is an ethic that Kierkegaard supports and that Kierkegaard can assume that all of his readers support, namely that child sacrifice is unacceptable. The only content of the ethical in Fear and Trembling that's articulated is that child sacrifice is murder. So it's not the content of the ethical that's at issue here. It's the form. And this is where one can make the second misreading of Kierkegaard. What's problematic about the ethical is when the ethical presents itself as the highest, as the absolute norm for what Kierkegaard elsewhere will call essential knowledge, our moral and religious lives. And so each of the 3 problems in Fear and Trembling starts out, if the universal is the highest, then Hegel is right. Don't worry about that if you don't have any Hegel in your quiver. But Abraham is lost. Because biblical faith is the constant refusal to say of any human community, including the religious communities of church and sect, this is the highest, this is the absolute, as he will sometimes put it, in such a way as to make God unnecessary and a mere spectator. Someone who can't get through to us because we've already enclosed ourselves in our community and its finality. So as with Marx, the point is that a particular human, all too human social construction takes itself to be reason absolute truth. And that's why, in Fear and Trembling, faith has to be absurd. Faith has to be paradoxical. Faith has to be madness. Because what presents itself as reason with the capital R turns out to be, on closer examination, ideological thinking. The laws and customs of a particular community, not in their content, which may be good, at least in many important respects, but in their form, namely as the highest, as the ultimate criterion. That's the idolatry that Kierkegaard wishes to oppose as a practitioner of ideology critique. Now, I give thanks to God for Eleanor Stump, for her passion for understanding and truth, for her love of students, and for the brilliance of her writing. And she has a long discussion of the Abraham story in one of her probably her most recent book, Wandering in Darkness. And she calls attention to the fact that she's not a Kierkegaard scholar. That's okay. Have no complaint with that. But she says that, oh dear, where is it? Here we go. She says that her interpretation is Kierkegaard-like. And I wish to take issue with her on that point. She says, God's command does not put Abraham in a dilemma where ordinary morality, there's the mistake, right there. She assumes that Kierkegaard is talking about ordinary morality. He's talking about something more specific than ordinary morality. He's talking about the morality of any particular human community that has absolutized itself and is treating itself as the highest norm for human life. And unless one remains clear about that, one will miss what Kierkegaard's point is. Now, maybe her interpretation of the Abraham story in the Bible is better than Kierkegaard's. I don't want to dispute that. But her interpretation is going to turn out not to be Kierkegaard-like. There's no dilemma between ordinary morality that conflicts with obedience to God. Rather, it constitutes a test of Abraham's character that he passes precisely by committing himself to the belief that morality and obedience to God are on the same side. And then she poses this question: why would a good God want to set his authority against morality rather than with it? And once again, this is an un-Kierkegaardian reading of the story because it's not morality that faith is against in Fear and Trembling. It's some human communities, any human community's morality, precisely to the degree that it takes its universality, vis-a-vis its members, to be the highest norm. And God has lots of good reasons for wanting to say that the life of faith stands in opposition to morality in that sense of the term. Now, I happen to think that across the Bible there are many texts which make that point much better than the Abraham story. Maybe not quite as dramatic as Kierkegaard is able to do with the Abraham story, but nevertheless, passages in the prophets and passages in the Gospels which call attention to the relativity and the inherent sinfulness of human traditions and human norms, not inherently in their content, but precisely insofar as they place themselves above the command of God. Read Mark 7 for one good example of that, when the Pharisees complained that the disciples of Jesus were eating with unwashed hands. But in any case, whether the Abraham story is the best biblical place to make that point, it seems to me that Kierkegaard's point is clear, and that it's an essential part of any authentically biblical faith, which is, in that sense, always countercultural. I'm very seldom in a situation where I have the opportunity to pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. But when I am, with a thought of Kierkegaard in my mind, I cross my fingers and I put my hand on my heart. I'm not kidding. I do this to remind myself that my allegiance to my nation and its culture, and to my church and its doctrines and its practices is relative. People always said, "Oh, that's relativism." And my response to that is, well, we are relative. Only God is absolute. And our beliefs and our practices have relative truth, relative merit, relative authority, but they are not the highest. And they are always subject to being invaded by something higher than themselves. I want to conclude these comments with quoting from the jury trial in Practice in Christianity. Kierkegaard brings together 10 members of the established order in Copenhagen, as if Jesus had appeared in the mode that he appears in the Gospels in 19th century Copenhagen. And my favorite response is from juror number 6, who happens to be the only clergyman in the group. And this is what he says. And this is, to me, the shortest, neatest summary of the Marxist dimension of Kierkegaard. It's true that we all look forward to an expected one, but that it is God in person who is to come is not the expectation of any rational person. And every religious person shudders at the blasphemy of which this person is guilty. Therefore, the authentic expected one, and I capitalize EO here for a reason, will look entirely different, will come as the most glorious flowering and the highest unfolding of the established order. And I have another capitalized E and O. Will summon all the clergy to a convention, present to it his achievements together with his credentials, and then, if in the balloting he has the majority, he will be accepted and hailed as the extraordinary that he is, the expected one. Now that's a particular form of heteronomy that Kierkegaard wishes to oppose, and the completion of my thought here is that he wants to suggest that the only real remedy for this kind of bad heteronomy is a better heteronomy. That one doesn't flee from this in the direction of autonomy, but in the direction of an autonomy, of a heteronomy of the self before God and of a community before God. And my other favorite passage from Practice in Christianity is the one in which he says, everybody ought to be in fear and trembling. Every individual ought to be in fear and trembling, and every established order ought to be in fear and trembling, because fear and trembling signifies that there is a God. Thank you for your attention.
Let me begin by expressing my thanks to Darren and the Institute for inviting me in the first instance to the introduction, which was incredibly gracious, and in particular to Paul Martins, who once upon a time I had the pleasure of teaching. But I'm going to reverse the standard line of gratitude by being grateful to him, but I'm going to add something which I've never had the pleasure of doing, which is that any inadequacies, errors, and flaws in this paper are solely due to him. A possible assignment for someone who is as much outside as inside Kierkegaard's studies is to prognosticate with respect to the future of Kierkegaard in the academy, intellectual world, and the church, since here relative disadvantage can be turned to relative advantage. The charge would not be without its terrors, even if we suspended the Kierkegaardian objection to prognostication. Professional theologians and philosophers tend to make embarrassing sibyls and seers very much utter their element. They compensate in Vedic tones for an enterprise that too easily can be associated with the reading of the flight of birds, or regressing to the status of a priest gawking at the entrails of an animal about to be immolated. But of course, Kierkegaard's objections cannot in the end be suspended, despite paganism and its modern artistic and philosophical imitators. The future is indeed contingent and unknowable, and may well wear the mask of eternity that does not come under the compulsions of time. Whoever prognosticates is a dealer in guesses on the evidence of the present and the past, and not the future. So I'm going to be ascetic, but let's be frank, I actually did write all my prognostications and deleted them for the purpose of the talk. And I deleted them further with a greater sort of animus when I realized that Merold was going to go before me in any event. And since Merold and I circle somewhat the same wagons, and since he is superior in his summary ability, I would have been more redundant than I'm likely to be. So I will do a Kierkegaard on this. I will act as the interpreter to speak to at least one thing necessary. And that one thing necessary is Kierkegaard's contribution to the understanding of the self. This, of course, understanding, it might be one thing, and that one thing might in fact be, in a certain light, simple, but it will turn out to be, I think, fairly ramified in the end. The necessity of dealing with Kierkegaard's descriptive and normative accounts of the self seems evident, given Kierkegaard's anatomy of authentic and inauthentic forms of selfhood, and the various figurations of authentic and inauthentic existence. The presentation and discussion of states of self-formation not only are promiscuous in Kierkegaard's work, arguably it is this aspect, or these aspects of Kierkegaard's work, that has the greatest influence in the 20th century interpretations of Kierkegaard, from Heidegger's atheistic reduction in Being and Time, through existentialism, right down to Derrida's postmodern divagations on the self. Postmodern readings have also tended to give renewed pertinence to the question of relation between Kierkegaard and the mystical tradition, often taken as foreclosed given Kierkegaard's well-known hostility to special states of affect, knowledge, and form of life. Now here I want to sketch Kierkegaard's anatomy of the self with glances at the negative relation to Hegelianism, won't decide between the authentic Hegel and his epigones, but correspondingly and especially a positive relationship to Kant's depiction of the self as elaborated not in the first two critiques, but rather with the view elaborated in Religion Within the Boundaries of Reason Alone. I also hope to cover, however sketchily, how Kierkegaard's view of the self, both as to how it relates to and differs from postmodern denial of narrative unity, as well as the apophatic self of the more radical forms of Christian mysticism, in which the unnameable self is the subjective correlative of the unnameable God. I will mention a few, and I'll cover in a very, very slight way, a broad band of texts, from texts attributed to pseudonyms to texts that are signed by Soren Kierkegaard. Now, what is indicated in the title, Perturbation of Chaos, is the sense that unless the self is touched or struck, and thus interrupted, but also supported from the outside, it remains chronically incoherent and tends towards nothingness. The incoherence can come in many forms. The self aborted and never begun because it has ever refused to will a self and a biography. The self which has had the resolve to begin and become determinate, but assumes a spurious coherence as it operates within the pre-given structures of society and as it lives throughout some form of despair that indicates the hopelessness of achieving coherence within the order of immanence. And the rare tragic hero, who may only be a figure of the past or of romantic novels, but who in any event stretches the envelope of ethos without ever breaking through or having had the experience of the transcendent breaking through to it. Whether the lead term is faith or love, forgiveness or repetition, the chaos and nothing of selves not begun, and begun but incapable of cementing meaning, is perturbed, disturbed by the encounter with a wholly other, identified as a biblical God or as this biblical God is given definitively in Christ. The self is perturbed, perforated, hold, divided into two temporal streams, that before and that after, with the after temporal stream being unanticipatable by that which came before, and the before stream being the object of the after, which involves a new and redeemed state or stream of temporality, a new order of self-relation, fully responsible for the before, and folding it into a complex temporality that forever bears the mark of a wound for which there is no cure, not even that of eternity or the absolute future, which in fact has affected the wound in the first case. There are many points on the textual arc of Kierkegaard's text to deal with this, but I'm going to start with fear and trembling. As is well known, fear and trembling is an expose in the double register of the excess disclosed in the biblical figure of Abraham. The first of these two registers is more or less positive, insofar as Abraham is the exemplar who is eminently worthy of our contemporary admiration for a compelling but not obviously seen greatness in which the relation to the totally other is constitutive of self-relation. The second, conducted in the negative register, depicts the knight of fate Abraham as being prepared to leave behind reason and both laws that are customary, love of children, and laws more general in scope and more absolute in intention, like thou shalt not kill. In and through both registers, Abraham is rendered as both an existential as well as a literary hyperbole. He is an existentially hyperbole that is stretched out in that he is the reach beyond the milieu of the socially and ethically constituted world, where he would have been Abram. And he is a hyperbole from a literary point of view, in that the well-known biblical character is defamiliarized in the various retellings of Midrash or the episode of the sacrifice of Abraham. The hyperbole is the responsibility of Johannes de Silencio, who denies that he himself is a person of faith, and thus could plausibly match Abraham's paradigmatic responsiveness. It is not accidental that Johannes de Silencio styles himself as a poet, and he depicts or narrates, as we might expect powerful poets would, that is, according to Emily Dickinson, he depicts and narrates at a slant. As a figure of Abraham is productively exaggerated or rendered anamorphic, we are at the same time put on an advisory not to think in too wooden a way about the contrast between the ethical and the religious dimension of existence, which is the major theme of the book. Even as we are also reminded that the religious is not reducible without remainder to the ethical. The regime of the ethical is double in fear and trembling, but one might even say duplex. At the lower level lies family life and its ordinances in which sacrifice of children cannot be sanctioned. At the upper level lies or rests the hero, for whom sacrifice of a child may seem necessary as well as contradictory, in that it breaks with the rules of the community in order to affirm and confirm it. Kierkegaard does not specify, but his familiarity with classical authors and his familiarity with Hegel's references to Greek tragedy would make him think of Creon and Agamemnon as prototypes of tragic heroes put into the impossible situation familiar or similar to that, rather, of Abraham. The immediate contrast, therefore, is between Abraham and these. And Kierkegaard does everything in his power to specify the difference. The teleological suspension of the ethical suggests, A, that the ethical dimension is not the highest dimension of existence, and that, in a sense, ethics aims towards a completion that is totally outside itself. And B, this completion in religion represents more nearly the annihilation than the preservation of the ethical, or at least of certain dimensions of it, and certainly its absoluteness. Everything important has changed, because I would suggest the grammar has changed from autonomy to some mode or other, in some mode or other, to the starkest version possible of heteronomy and pure obedience. In other words, not a vocabulary change, a grammatical change. As a divine command issued to Abraham in Genesis is a synecdoche of Abraham being called out, so also it is the case in fear and trembling. Abraham is a stranger before his obedience to the divine commandment makes it obvious that he is strange and that he is both unaccommodated and unable to provide an account for his decision to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham has become unintelligible. He can neither be understood nor understand himself. But Abraham, as intercalated or called into being as a singular who emerges in leaving behind of intelligibility, not only judges, and we also judge with him, that these forms of existence with which he might have identified prior to the event, he now identifies as superficial, as not gelling the self into coherence. Nonetheless, he also goes back to the quotidian life of the family as the normal or good father. The implication is that even in excess, there is a relation between the starting point and the terminus, where someone is determined by the response of faith, as it opens a wound between a mode of existence, which precisely as tending towards universality and repeatability, tends towards vacuity, and another modality of existence at once more angular and more weighty. Now, in the act of obedience, wherein Abraham becomes the knight of faith, he emerges as a new and intense shape of lived time that relates to his life lived before, which did not anticipate it. Really, that as the knight of faith, Abraham exemplifies repetition. Repetition is formally distinguished from recollection, in that the relation to the totally other leads to an untoward coherence of selfhood that cannot truly be owned or only owned as not one's own. What one has to, pun intended, to own up to is the incoherence and vacuity of the self lived according to societal or self-imposed norms. A vacuity that can be covered up by appealing to the decision and resolve required to overcome the readily obvious incoherence and vacuity of the aesthetic stage of existence. The aesthetic is the state of rest, becoming and development which are the conditions of determinate life, and thus actuality are refused. The aesthetic is the realm of entertaining any number of possible lives. Possibility contrasts with potentiality, which is teleologically indexed, and therefore belongs to the sphere of the ethical. Insofar as the ethical, however, is only ethical, it operates on the plane of immanence. And in the overcoming of incoherence and the vacuity of the aesthetic, the ethical, whether more nearly in its incremental or dramatic mode, introduces a coherence and solidity that is a simulacrum. Defined formally, repetition is repetition forward, which bears a responsibility for prior denials of selfhood and prior formations of selfhood that tend towards imminent satisfaction. Kierkegaard's deepest interest, however, is not a genealogy of formations of selfhood, but with exposing any and all inhibition to the deepened temporality of the self which defines it. Thus, in the end, not only does Kierkegaard supplement the genealogical analysis with a structural analysis and write such texts as Philosophical Fragments and Concluding on Scientific Postscript, which speak to the inhibition under the ordinance of sin, but arguably the structural analysis cuts across the genealogical analysis, both existentially and theologically, and deepens it. Phenomenologically, only the relation with the totally other, which punctures every form of satisfaction, allows a self to come to be, and allows true freedom, synonymous with true care and responsibility for the self. Like Kant before him in religion, Kierkegaard not only is willing to put the category of sin into play as a proper description of some fundamental aspect of the self, but also describes the relation between the self in a purely self-serving mode of temporality and the self in a mode of temporality that is subtended in and through the relation to a reality that exceeds it in the law of immanence. I want to make a comparison between philosophical fragments and Kant's religion text. Philosophical fragments should be seen to engage in important respects Kant's reflection on the self in books 1 and 2 of Religion, which to an appreciable extent represents the translation into a philosophical idiom of Luther's simul justus et peccator, simultaneously justified and sinful. In that text, Kant famously engages the biblical text not as revelation, but as holding clues which need to be brought out in philosophical analysis as to how to think the possibility of radical change in a self that is radically evil to the extent to which, at a transcendental level, such a self has chosen an evil maxim. Should a change at this level be possible or actual, there has to be a cut or perforation between the unconverted and the converted self and their temporal enactment, with the converted self providing narrative unity and taking responsibility for the temporality that seems as if it belongs to another person. Now, much could be said about what Kant achieves or fails to achieve in his extraordinary text, but all I wish to do here is to establish what I might call a Kantian watermark for Kierkegaard's very un-Hegelian style reflection for the narrative unity of the self. But with that watermark down, I want to draw attention to the differences. The original text has at least 5 or 6 differences. I will only treat you to 3, and I think you should be grateful for that. My favorite word thus far, in my own speech, which obviously suggests a certain degree of narcissism, is perforation. So for the moment, I think the perturbed self, we can call it the perforated self, the hold self. If you're comparing and contrasting Kant, one of the ways of contrasting Kant and Kierkegaard here, and I'm regarding the subtext of Kierkegaard as Kant, is to talk about the coding of, or the code of the perforation. What that means, I think, will become fairly clear once I provide my paragraph. While both Kant and Kierkegaard speak of an absolute severance in the temporal stream, denied by the Romantics, so this is untrivial, denied by the Romantics and subsequently by Hegel, the coding of the relationship is different. In Kant, the relation between the newly ordered stream of temporality which defines me, in terms of the biblical images, the new man, and the old temporal stream, again, a biblical image, the old man, is that of autonomy. Whereas in the case of Kierkegaard, the coding is that of heteronomy. Coding makes a grammatical difference. In Kierkegaard, we are talking more about a suffering and a passion, a passio essendi, rather than a manner of insistence or conatus essendi. Given his epistemology, Kant refuses to think of the divine in general, or Christ in particular, as being the cause of the transformation, which splits the self into 2 temporal streams within a common narrative, and from the point of view of explanation, sidelines a category such as grace. The result is that Kant's self, one Munchausen-like, pulls itself up by the pit by its own bootstraps, even as Kant admits it has no capacity to do so. Doubtless Kierkegaard thinks that Kant is theologically wrong. More importantly, since Kant, of course, purportedly is not doing theology but philosophy, Kierkegaard thinks that Kant is phenomenologically wrong. The level of disturbance of the would-be homogeneous self and the level of vertical shift into new order of temporal coherence is such that it suggests the actual effect of an alterity, the actual effect of God. Second, the exacerbation of perforation and the amplification of contrast between the unconverted and the converted self. Over against Kant, the perforation of what might have been, what would have been a homogeneous temporality, this is exacerbated in Kierkegaard, such that Kierkegaard brings out the hysterical nature of the self, which has a formal but not material narrative unity. I know that you know this hysterical nature of the self. The emphasis here falls on hysteria in the etymological sense of cut, which is quite distinct from the desperation and histrionics of the immunization from ecstatic temporality of lived time before perforation. You could say that I'm working with a contrast between hysteria and histrionic. Usually we tend sort of to load them on to one particular person that we dislike, someone hysterical and someone is histrionic. I think Kierkegaard is suggesting sort of that hysteria sort of is very different than histrionic. Histrionics is sort of from the self which is homogeneous. Hysteria is the self which is cut, and the cut sort of between the unconverted and converted. But otherwise, faith as generated in an ingression of alterity can only be experienced as offense, as an assault on the enclosure of self, however complacent, desperate, or both. And although formally Kant and Kierkegaard agree that there is nothing in the unconverted self that will mediate conversion, Kierkegaard is the more emphatic of the two, if only for the reason that he is more prepared to speculate about inhibitions. In comparison to Kant in his account of perforation, Kierkegaard elevates the importance of time by speaking of the effect of alterity in temporal terms, that is, the moment or instance which suggests a punctual cut, even as it gets defined as a phenomenon that reorders and deepens a finite temporality that constitutes the self. And third, the estimate of self-enclosure, that is, the estimate of sin. There is another difference again, and this has to do with Kierkegaard's different estimate of the degree of self-enclosure possible in an unconverted self. In religion, Kant famously asserted that the immorality of the self had limits, given the finitude, embodiedness, fragility, and sociality of the self. This meant that Kant put a block in the self-conscious on any and all consideration of the self as potentially or actually demonic. Now, at the level of common sense, I mean, Kant is right. At the level of common sense, Kierkegaard, I think, accepts Kant's point. But at another level, I think he thinks it is obtuse and trades in metaphysical distinctions between human beings and would-be pure spirits, against which Kant has affected to sneer. The issue, after all, has to be whether the exercise of self-assertion is such that, practically speaking, it will brook no bounds, and that is, become a form of infinity, whether a pure form of infinity or a bad infinity, to use Hegel's terms. Kierkegaard does think this possible, and there are truly demonic or limit instances of enclosing reserve, where incomprehensibility and silence becomes the parody of what we observe in Abraham. Zizek tells us that when we come to the question of radical evil, that counterintuitively there may be a relation between Immanuel Kant and the Marquis de Sade. He does not tell us that there might even be a closer relation between Kierkegaard and the Marquis de Sade, as the latter both insists on and dramatizes human beings' approximation to an evil that breaks the bounds of the human, both in terms of transgressive force and iterative quality. And Zizek reminds us also to look more closely at Schelling's account of human freedom, which put the demonic into play, thereby facilitating reconsideration of the relation between Kierkegaard and Schelling, which Kierkegaard downplays at every possible juncture, if not forecloses altogether. I want briefly just to end sort of by talking a little bit about the compare and contrast between Kierkegaard's perforated view of the self and what we might find in Christian mysticism, apophatic self, and sort of with a final word sort of on postmodern selves. So let me speak briefly. I want to speak briefly to two discourses brought into conversation with Kierkegaard recently, and brought into conversation in particular with Kierkegaard's hyperbolic, perforated self, That is, the discourses of Christian mysticism and postmodernity. Now, it would be good to keep in mind that neither is one thing, and the latter, in particular, is a loose set of family resemblances with decidedly different hospitality ratios to Christianity and to Christian theology. I will make a few remarks on the opportunities and challenges of both. If the interest, our common interest, is mapping either of the discourses onto Kierkegaard's view of self and language and vice versa. Let me start with mysticism, and Simon Podmore's book sort of is in the background here, and it's a wonderful book. So as Merold graciously gave my book a plug, let me also give Simon's 2011 book a plug. Simon, I think, has helped us sort of to reconsider whether we can put Kierkegaard and mystical theology into conversation by not allowing Kierkegaard's obvious hostility to mysticism to be decisive. We can acknowledge the provocation of the misalliance of mysticism and speculative thought in his own day, in Bishop Martensen, in Hegel, and in Franz von Baader. But the fact of the matter is that all three are giving very, very loose interpretations and very, very rationalistic interpretations of mystical theology, which after all sort of we would have assumed is going to put the emphasis upon unknowing and not knowing. Second, there's an obvious overlap. Mystical theology, just as the case in Kierkegaard, is hyperbolic. It's hyperbolic in the two dimensions that I referred to. There's a stretching of language, and there's a stretching, an ecstatic stretching of the self beyond the communally ordained self and beyond the language games that self ordinarily plays. Therefore, we've got a convergence. We've got the conditions of the possibility of a conversation. The conditions of the possibility of a conversation are not the same as one thing equals another, so let me just issue some challenges with respect to thinking that. In this instance, I'm not in fact critiquing Podmore's book, it's simply issuing an advisory when we actually have a conversation. Conversation is also sometimes an argument. We have to remember in the case of Kierkegaard, there is a Protestant history, and he is in that trajectory. That is, he's in the trajectory sort of Luther's attack against Theologia Gloria and a participatory metaphysics. And what's wrong with the theology of glory and the participative metaphysics is that there is a de-emphasis upon grace and a corresponding elevation of nature, in which, to use Kierkegaard's terms, we sort of are running the risk of dampening or erasing the infinite qualitative difference between God and everything else. Second, there is a difference in the valence of the exception. In mystical theology, the mystic seems to be an ersatz for the saint, and both can have iconic function. Both are visible, both sort of are entities to be admired. In contrast, in Kierkegaard, the following of Christ is invisible, and the more invisible, the better. We do seem to have the movement towards binaries, that is, a contrast between the prophet and the saint, a contrast between the disciple and the mystic. Third, it is the case that when we use locutions like the hiddenness of God and divine incomprehensibility, that those terms overlap. There certainly are grounds for a conversation. But the hiddenness of God also contrasts with incomprehensibility, as that term sort of functions as part and parcel of a particular metaphysical routine. I'm Roman Catholic, I play the routine, so it's not as facetious and sarcastic as it might sound. In the latter case, that is, in the case of when we're talking about the hiddenness of God, we're talking about God as an agent or a possible agent whose intention sort of is not disclosed to us. The incomprehensibility of God is simply sort of putting a check sort of on our ambition with respect to whether we do or do not know God fully in the way that we might know something else. Again, fourth with God. There is a tendency in mystical theology towards impersonalism. A tendency is also not a fact. But clearly, in Kierkegaard, God is person, and God is person not by analogy. That is, we call God person because we think that God sort of will show sort of certain intentionalities, so that sort of is our prerogative. It goes the other way. God is, if you like, the only person, or person with a capital P, and it is this person who founds and grounds us as persons through grace and forgiveness. Fifth, the register of the breakthrough. Mysticism has as its platform regimes of initiation and preparation, moral preparation. And the capstone is an epistemic ecstasy or contemplative ecstasy. Kierkegaard, however, is going to speak to the cut and the perforation that will always have destabilized the self. The self will never have been prepared for God. The self will never have built enough foundation so that God sort of is possible ontologically or logically. Again, we could say that historical formulation of the self, that is, the self as cut, can be distinguished from a histrionic excess of the self so that is, shall we say, perfected in this ecstasy, goes out of itself, however, as that self has already sort of being a unity of time, a unity of self, and simply this sort of is the unity of the self at its own most. And lastly, there is the issue of what happens to sin. It would do a grave injustice to mysticism to say that so they have no correlative or synonym with sin. If one was dealing with medieval mysticism, the synonym probably would be in German Eigenwille, self-will. So Eigenwille is there sort of as that inhibition which has to make way sort of for the unloose self, that self before God, that ecstatic self, and Meister Eckhart has the wonderful term Gelassenheit, Heidegger also avails of it. But nonetheless, even those of us who would support Christian mysticism would want to suggest that there is nothing in Christian mysticism which quite has the terrified emphasis that Kierkegaard has on involution, enclosing reserve, where one sort of is moving towards a condition of nothingness. This does not mean, of course, that Kierkegaard is alone on this. It doesn't mean simply also that he is only a Lutheran. It could mean, in addition, that he is a good Augustinian. And that's a plug sort of, for Lee Barrett. In conclusion, I realize many things here, but I also realize that I have not justified my title, The Rule of Chaos and the Perturbation of Love. Admittedly, the title is rather precious in any event, so perhaps it is just as well. But that's not the real reason, but rather the omission of a section on the chaoses or nothings of the unrepentant self in its vacuous distensions and intentions. Love, or its alias of divine command, paradox, perturbs what is a matrix already disturbed, already moving towards nothing, and it provides and makes possible a figuration of the self as ineluctably needy and necessarily wounded. I suspended my meontological reflections in favor of presenting a cleaner outline of a self, not only different from that of the Enlightenment, Romanticism and idealism, but also from Kant, who lays down its overall pattern, which Kierkegaard madly improvises on and deranges. I have been therefore exorbitantly thetic and flattened out all kinds of differences between texts in Kierkegaard, developments and leaving behinds, and provided no analysis of the spectrum of apology indicated by or between the various pseudonyms and the text which are assigned to Kierkegaard. But there is a thesis, we can comfort oneself in that Kierkegaard's view of the self as perforated is unique, at worst relatively unique, and possibly unique all the way down. And that he gives a view of the self as constituted and deconstituted at once. And that this is his view of the person, And he is asking us to make this the view that we have of the person. Thank you very much.
Just a brief observation. I think it's interesting and happy that both of our papers focused on the theme of alterity, of otherness, of transcendence and heteronomy, of ideas that sort of flow into one another. They turned out to be complementary in a way that we didn't plan, I think. I ended up talking about the need to make a transition from a bad heteronomy to a good heteronomy on the assumption that in any case we're going to be heteronymous and shouldn't try to escape from that. But I didn't talk at all about the nature of that transition and so forth, but especially in the part of Cyril's paper in which he was contrasting Kierkegaard and Kant, he posed several important issues about the nature of that transition, and if I can put it this way, about the role of alterity in the possibility of that transition. So I think in that way there was a rather happy matching of the two papers, and we read them in the right order.
I anticipated that Merold would steal most of my thunder, which he did. But it also meant that...
But not so elegantly as you put it.
But I think so that one of the ways in which sort of we overlap is that the second hemisphere of the conversation which I mentioned was covered in significant part by Merold in any event. That is, the way in which much of postmodern thought is at least against the same things that Kierkegaard was against. It's against the notion sort of itself as a subject, a pre-given subject, a pre-given substance, even worse. And that one will have sort of, if you're going to talk sort of about a self, there's going to be sort of at least some ratio of non-identity. That is going to be helpful insofar as people can come together sort of by the common hate object or a set of hate objects. But we all know what happens sort of, once the hate objects, whether it's metaphysical tradition or substantial selves, go by the board, that those particular conversers may either turn against each other or may be forced to turn against each other because the differences have been hidden. So one of the things I think that one has to really be aware of when sort of we're talking sort of about postmodern thought, in addition to the obvious point sort of which bears repeating, that there is no such thing sort of as postmodern thought. There are constellations of discourses which are attacking traditions in various ways and repeating traditions in various ways. Then one has to actually talk about what degree of hospitality do various discourses have with respect sort of to Kierkegaard or any sort of Christian thinker. Merold sort of in his own work sort of when he has written on Levinas and Kierkegaard, that I take it to be a wonderful example of a very significant hospitality ratio. Derrida has some degree of hospitality ratio, because sort of he puts into play himself Kierkegaard and Immanuel Levinas. And secondly, Derrida has some hospitality ratio because at least he's some kind of reader of St. Augustine. And St. Augustine, I think, sort of is that person sort of whom we have mentioned and will continue to mention and not discuss. But I do think so that there are forms of postmodern thought in which the hospitality ratio sort of is so slender and the hostility ratio is so heavy. It may very well be so that all sort of we can get sort of is some kind of negative purchase on someone like Kierkegaard. An example. Gilles Deleuze is, I think, a great philosopher. He is someone sort of who is against a substantial self. He is against the self as subject. But he is not prepared to accept a non-self-identical subject which repeats itself and which we have a ratio of unity. His self is multiple all the way down. in which case then sort of, if you are plural and you are plural, it really sort of is only sort of in an order of nomination, so that I'm sort of going to act towards you as if sort of the proper name sort of signifies something that is a unitive narrative or a unitive subject. That would be sort of heterology. We've got sort of a self-identical self, a monological subject. We've got a heterological subject, which sort of is essentially the contrary. And we've got a number of positions in between, and one of those positions in between of a non-monological and a not quite heterological self is Soren Kierkegaard.
Just quickly, I think it's interesting that both of us think it's important to read Kierkegaard in relationship to that strange cluster of thinkers who get called postmodern, that we are in complete agreement that there are different ratios of convergence and divergence. And I just want to underscore one of the ways in which I tried to open the possibility of that sort of exploration in order to appreciate what can be learned from and gained from secular and even atheistic postmodern philosophers. The hurdle that many people have to get over in order to take them seriously at all is, oh, but that's relativism. And of course, if all human thought is relative in the variety of ways in which postmodern philosophers say it is, and there is no God, there is nothing that is absolute, well, then you're left with nothing but relativism. But what I want to say in response to that is we are relative, and there is a God who is absolute, and it's just possible that what postmodern philosophers say about our relativity is an interesting commentary on themes that could be developed and which are developed by Augustine and Kierkegaard and a whole variety of other thinkers in a Christian context. And so the specter of relativism doesn't need to scare us away from thinkers any more than their atheism does. I'm fond of saying God once spoke to people through Balaam's ass. And if he did that, then he probably could speak through contemporary atheists, some things that we might learn from.
On that note, we're going to turn it over to you. Have a microphone here on either side, if you'd come to the microphone so we can hear your question or comment for our panelists. Ralph.
Our time is short. Can you hear me?
Maybe turn that on, see if it's
On.
oh.
Ralph?
Now on?
Come up here.
Yeah, this one.
Thank you both for these papers, from which I've learned a great deal. My question is directed to Professor Westphal, to whom I've sent students in the past to study with him at Fordham very happily. If I understand him right, he's saying that we are both, we're doubly relativized in very healthy ways by the very fact of our being radically placed within social, linguistic, economic cultures and structures that we don't choose for ourselves, but that in a real sense choose us. Secondly, more importantly, we're relativized by God's own utter sovereignty and authority because He, God, is alone absolute. My two questions then are these: do these two radically relativizing claims then make, first of all, if the heart of human existence is to stand in utter solitary fear and trembling before God, doesn't this make impossible all authoritative communities, and most especially the body of Christ called the church? Except as it might exist, and some of you will recognize this phrase, as a voluntary society of like-minded believers. That's the Baptist definition of what a church is. I am one of those, as you probably know. If you voluntarily enter a society, you can just as voluntarily leave it. So one Baptist a believer, two Baptists a church, three Baptists a church split. So doesn't this render authoritative community virtually impossible? I wanted to ask Steve Evans this question last night. Where is the church in Kierkegaard? But secondly, doesn't it also render all ethical action essentially null and void if it is already relativized from the start? How would Martin Luther King have ever acted with an authoritative voice from the Lord if he knew that from the start his voice had already been radically relativized? Or on the other extreme, what check is there upon the person who perceives the divine command to come to him or her standing in solitary existence before God? And here the awful example is 14 miles outside Baylor with David Koresh, who had a divine command saying that he alone could have sex with all the people at the Davidian compound. Unlike Jim Jones, who let people drink the Kool-Aid, Koresh corralled them in, shot them, and burned 76 people alive because the Lord had divinely commanded him to do so. What check upon David Koresh then could come from Kierkegaard?
I don't think the problem of the church is any more a problem than the fact that the first commandment is first and the second commandment is second. That there is a not necessarily temporal, but in some sense maybe logical priority of the individual's relationship to God, which is the condition for the possibility of a right relationship to human others at the level of personal ethics, at the level of community, including Christian community in the church. It seems to me that what Kierkegaard wants to insist upon is that the communal not be the condition for the possibility of our relationship to God, in the sense that any human community, political, social, cultural, or religious, is the highest norm for that relationship. In other words, Kierkegaard is a Protestant, and he has a Protestant view of the church as a finite, all too human entity in and through which God works. Now, it's true that Kierkegaard doesn't thematize the church. He doesn't have an ecclesiology, and that's a limitation to his thinking. But I don't, just as he can have an ethics of love of neighbor that follows after his analysis, logically speaking, of being alone before God. So there's plenty of room for having a theology of the church, as long as one doesn't absolutize the church. And his concern about that was not about the Catholic Church, but about the Lutheran Church, about culture Protestantism. And if he lived in Baylor, it would be the Baptist Church he'd be worried about, or at least one of the many different Baptist churches that there are. Kenneth Scott Latourette, the great church historian at Yale, told me once that at the time he was writing, there were 27 different Baptist denominations in the United States. The second part of the question was about Koresh and that kind of stuff. I certainly hope that one's final hope for protection against that doesn't rely upon the church. The church gave us the Crusades, the church gave us anti-Semitism, the church gave us, in many respects, fascism and Nazism. Every individual needs to be in fear and trembling before God, and every established order, including churches, needs to be in fear and trembling before God. And so, yes, indeed, there need to be voices. But the fact of our relativity doesn't necessarily mean timidity. And you mentioned Martin Luther King. The Apostle Paul was not particularly timid about proclaiming the gospel. But he says we see as in a mirror dimly, or through a glass darkly. We hold this truth in earthen vessels. He was aware of that dimension of the limitation, and yet he was bold in proclaiming the gospel and leaving it up to the Holy Spirit to take his human, all too human words and make them to the people to whom he spoke the Word of God. And apparently it happened on a fairly wide basis.
Is this, I guess I'll come.
Heather,
Come up here.
I actually have a very related question. In hearing you talk about the moral relativity that Kierkegaard had, it sounded to me like you were describing conscience, and I was wondering if that's an appropriate interpretation of what you were saying. If conscience is the sort of dynamic moral discernment of a person before God, can what you were saying be understood in the same way, or is that a misreading?
Yeah. I don't think Kierkegaard is talking about conscience. I think he's talking about social ethos, the conscience of a community, not the conscience of an individual.
Okay.
And the Hegelian term that he uses, I think best translates as the laws and customs of a community, or the laws and customs of a people. Now, I think if you ask Kierkegaard, what about an individual's conscience? He will say that in the same way in which the ethical as the ethos of a community is human, all too human, the conscience of the individual is human, all too human. It is conditioned, it is sinful and fallen and perverse, and just as there is God-given truth in the ethical, so there is God-given insight in conscience. It's just that neither the individual's conscience nor the ethos of a community is an utterly reliable absolute norm. There's a frightful simul insight and simul distortion in conscience and in community. So conscience can tell us to do terrible things, and conscience can bring us back from doing terrible things. And social ethics can do wonderful things in overcoming various forms of social evil. And social ethics can legitimize social evils of utterly horrendous forms. I hope that's helpful.
Betty, thank you.
You two will come up here and we'll.
This is nerve-wracking. Dr. O'Regan, in listening to your talk, and listening to your idea of the pervert itself, and seeing that in the title, this idea of love, I was reminded of Jean-Luc Nancy's idea that love creates a fissure, and even maybe more radically, that in love the self is constituted broken, and for him that represents religious love, parental love, romantic love, and all kinds of love. And I was wondering if you have a very specific view of love that you're presenting, or and if it includes such a wide variety, or since you mostly spoke about fear and trembling and faith, if you mean mostly religious love and agape and so on.
All right. One, I was simply interpreting Kierkegaard. Two, as I was interpreting Kierkegaard and given his analysis of what I think he thinks the self is, as that self is distinguished from other philosophical, theological contenders, and as it's distinguished operationally from how sort of people do not understand themselves in precisely this way, in fact, fail to understand themselves in this particular way. So I want to set that as the platform to answer the question. I take it as not really an accident that Jean-Luc Nancy can perform the kind of generalization that you just suggested. He doesn't need the provocation, I suppose, of Kierkegaard. There's all kinds of provocation around. But suppose for the moment that we thought of him as being directly concerned with and offering an interpretation of Kierkegaard, what would it look like, and what is happening sort of in this kind of interpretation or this kind of hermeneutic? I think it would be typical of Jean-Luc Nancy to do, and this would be sort of the pathway has been laid down sort of by Heidegger in Being and Time. if religion is going sort of to have any value, it has a value of utility. That it might sort of, shall we say, against its own best intentions, or it might per accident have revealed something about something that's important outside the dogmatism and moralism sort of which besets it. And Jean-Luc Nancy has that particular view. I mean, this sort of is a postmodern view, but also genealogically, he has no time for Christianity whatsoever. But even if you have no time, Christianity can provide a set of opportunities. Very much like Heidegger, you can be methodologically atheistic, but find sort of that maybe Christianity provides you with some narrative opportunities, symbolic opportunities. One symbolic opportunity is that more, shall we say, than self-satisfied cultural selves, more sort of than self-perfecting self or self-help selves, Christianity perhaps at various points did suggest that there is a brokenness within self, whatever the stimulus or whatever the agent sort of which caused the brokenness, that seems to be phenomenological to what is given. So Christianity can provide sort of a set of symbols and narratives which help you, but help you to think. But then once it helps you to think, there's no reason not to generalize. In other words, it will have been the provocation, it will not be the answer. It simply will have given you the question and an intimation, a formal signification as to what the truth is. So therefore you can go on sort of perfectly happy to indicate sort of that, well, of course it occurs outside religion, and if it's true, it necessarily will occur outside religion and will sort of be part sort of a general phenomenological description. Christianity is a restricted discursive economy. There's no reason sort of to think that that restricted economy has universalizability. It just gave an intimation, metaphorical intimation of a truth which has to be redeemed otherwise, and he's in sort of this particular mood to redeem it. So the movement from restricted to universal means that whatever Christianity would have given you, and I think this is actually something that happens in Heidegger, also happens in Kant. Whatever Christianity would have given you, you don't have to be grateful for it. It just kind of allowed the thing to kind of jump a little bit sort of more quickly, for which not merely can you, but you're obliged to be ungrateful. Jean-Luc Nancy is obliged to be ungrateful.
Very nice, very nice.
One quick question.
Fourth critique is alive in postmodern thinkers who talk
Thank
about
you
religion.
for both of you and your comments on especially on the converted and unconverted self. My question has to do with the role of divine image and likeness in this radical break, this hysteria that occurs with the conversion experience of an objective other, the one absolute, which is God. And I'm curious about this, I guess, in two fronts, because Cyril, you mentioned the way in which coherence was a simulacrum, coherence and stability were a simulacrum, and I wasn't sure if there was some continuity between the first temporal stream and the second, but also whether there might be any kind of distinction between how Kierkegaard's handling, like you said, symbol as something that's more than generalizable than as opposed to Kant.
Let me begin on that one. I just want to remind people why I use the word simulacrum. One of the things that Kierkegaard is dead set against is cultural formations of the self where the self is satisfied, and or any metaphysical identifications of the self whereby you say that the self sort of is not pre-given, but the self becomes, and as it becomes, I mean, we have sort of this high-flown sort of romantic rhetoric of self-formation, and that what the artist is, as the artist creates, the artist really is ultimately in the business of creating himself or herself. But that kind of solidity, which is precisely not the refusal, in fact, sort of it is to launch the venture or adventure of the self. The idea so that you then can have a self-satisfied closure, which then will give you homogeneous time as a kind of backflow, that's a simulacrum. It will give you the sense of weight as opposed to the weightlessness of the aesthetic, who's flitting to and fro, who's refusing to make decision. And we know sort of that vacuity Milan Kundera would name so the unbearable lightness of being. But what's going to happen is the substitution, the ethical substitution at its worst, is going to be the bearable weight of being, as if somehow or other you were able sort of to get at that closure. What Kierkegaard is doing, I think, sort of is he's talking about the unbearable weight of being. But the unbearable weight of being, it is unbearable. It's not bearable because it ain't yours to bear. And in that way, I think there is, I almost hear tinkling again Augustine in the background when Augustine is talking sort of about the weight of love. That to be loved is a condition of loving God and loving the neighbor. But Augustine does say, and Augustine had his own vacuities. I mean, he was his own rhetor. He was a rhetor. He wasn't. So there is, you have the pondus amor. You got the weight of love, and the weight of love that is the gift of you to yourself. But you're not bearing it. You're not bearing it alone. It is unbearable by you. And you, so that it's the degree to which you are bearing it, and therefore you are the bearer of that love. You're the bearer of that love, sort of not all the way through. And you are the bearer of that love only in the most superficial way possible. So Augustine comes in again, sort of, as a way, I think, to understand sort of that the impossibility of love is not your possibility. It's not your possibility. It never will be your possibility. And that has got to do with the preparation, which is a condition sort of the possibility of you being you, and you having a relationship with God, and you, in fact, having any form of self-identity that would matter.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have to perforate this conversation, but join me in thanking Cyril O'Regan and Merold Westphal.
Thank you, hysterical.